Wind, Sand, and Stars by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Chapter 8. Prisoner of the Sand. Part 3. We were resting on the ground beside the plain. Nearly 40 miles of wandering this day. The last drop of liquid had been drained. No sign of life had appeared to the east. No plane had soared overhead. How long should we be able to hold out? Already our thirst was terrible. We had built up a great pyre out of bits of the splintered wing. Our gasoline was ready, and we had flung on the heaped sheets of metal whose magnesium coating would burn with a hard, white flame. We were waiting now for night to come down before we lighted our conflagration. But where were there men to see it? Night fell, and the flames rose. Prayerfully we watched our mute and radiant Fanion mount resplendent into the night. As I looked, I said to myself that this message was not only a cry for help. It was fraught also with a great deal of love. We were begging water, but we were also begging the communion of human society. Only man can create fire. Let another flame light up the night. Let man answer man. I was haunted by a vision of my wife's eyes under the halo of her hat. Of her face I could see only the eyes, questioning me, looking at me yearningly. I am answering with all my strength. What flame could leap higher than this that darts up into the night from my heart? What I could do, I have done. What we could do, we have done. Nearly 40 miles, almost without a drop to drink. Now there was no water left. Was it our fault that we could wait no longer? Suppose we had sat quietly by the plain, taking suck at the mouths of our water bottles. But from the moment I breathed in the moist bottom of the tin cup, a clock had started up in me. From the second when I had sucked up the last drop, I had begun to slip downhill. Could I help it if time, like a river, was carrying me away? Prévost was weeping. I tapped him on the shoulder and said to console him, "If we're done for, we're done for, and that's all there is to it." He said, "Do you think it's me I'm bawling about?" I might have known it. It was evident enough. Nothing is unbearable. Tomorrow and the day after, I should learn that nothing was really unbearable. I had never really believed in torture. Reading Poe as a kid, I had already said as much to myself. Once, jammed in the cabin of a plane, I thought I was going to drown, and I had not suffered much. Several times it had seemed to me that the final smash-up was coming, and I don't remember that I thought of it as a cosmic event. And I didn't believe this was going to be agonizing either. There will be time tomorrow to find out stranger things about it. Meanwhile, God knows that despite the bonfire I had decidedly given up hope that our cries would be heard by the world. Do you think it's me? There you have what is truly unbearable. Every time I saw those yearning eyes, it was as if a flame were searing me. They were like a scream for help, like the flares of a sinking ship. I felt that I should not sit idly by. I should jump up and run, anywhere, straight ahead of me. What a strange reversal of roles. But I have always thought it would be like this. Still, I needed Prévost beside me to be quite sure of it. Prévost was a level-headed fellow. He loved life. And yet Prévost no more than I was wringing his hands at the sight of death, the way we are told men do. But there did exist something that he could not bear any more than I could. I was perfectly ready to fall asleep, whether for a night or for eternity. If I did fall asleep, I could not even know whether it was for the one or for the other, and the peace of sleep. But that cry that would be sent up at home, that great wail of desolation, that was what I could not bear. I could not stand idly by and look on at that disaster. Each second of silence drove the knife deeper into someone I loved. At the thought, a blind rage surged up in me. Why do these chains bind me and prevent me from rescuing those who are drowning? Why does our conflagration not carry our cry to the ends of the world? Hear me, you out there. Patience. We are coming to save you. The magnesium had been licked off and the metal was glowing red. There was left only a heap of embers round which we crouched to warm ourselves. Our flaming call had spent itself. Had it set anything in the world in motion? I knew well enough that it hadn't. Here was a prayer that had of necessity gone unheard. That was that. I ought to get some sleep. At daybreak, I took a rag and mopped up a little dew on the wings. The mixture of water and paint and oil yielded a spoonful of nauseating liquid which we sipped because it would at least moisten our lips. After this banquet, Prévost said, "Thank God we've got a gun." Instantly I became furious and turned on him with an aggressiveness which I regretted directly I felt it. There was nothing I should have loathed more at that moment than a gush of sentimentality. I am so made that I have to believe that everything is simple. Birth is simple, growing up is simple, and dying of thirst is simple. I watched Prévost out of the corner of my eye, ready to wound his feelings if that was necessary to shut him up. But Prévost had spoken without emotion. He had been discussing a matter of hygiene, and might have said, in the same tone, "We ought to wash our hands." That being so, we were agreed. Indeed, already yesterday, my eye falling by chance on the leather holster, the same thought had crossed my mind, and with me, too, it had been a reasonable reflex, not an emotional one. Pathos resides in social man, not in the individual. What was pathetic was our powerlessness to reassure those for whom we were responsible. Now, not what we might do with the gun. There was still no sign that we were being sought, or rather, they were doubtless hunting for us elsewhere, probably in Arabia. We were to hear no sound of a plane until the day after we had abandoned our own. And if ships did pass overhead, what could that mean to us? What could they see in us except two black dots among the thousand shadowy dots in the desert? Absurd to think of being distinguishable from them. None of the reflections that might be attributed to me on the score of this torture would be true. I should not feel in the least tortured. The aerial rescue party would seem to me each time I sighted one to be moving through a universe that was not mine. When searchers have to cover 2,000 miles of territory, it takes them a good 2 weeks to spot a plane in the desert from the sky. They were probably looking for us all along the line, from Tripoli to Persia. And still, with all this, I clung to the slim chance that they might pick us out. Was that not our only chance of being saved? I changed my tactics, determining to go reconnoitering by myself. Prévost would get another bonfire together and kindle it in the event that visitors showed up. But we were to have no callers that day. So off I went, without knowing whether or not I should have the stamina to come back. I remembered what I knew about this Libyan desert. When, in the Sahara, humidity is still at 40% of saturation. It is only 18 here in Libya. Life here evaporates like a vapor. Bedouins, explorers, and colonial officers all tell us that a man may go 19 hours without water. Thereafter his eyes fill with light, and that marks the beginning of the end. The progress made by thirst is swift and terrible, But this northeast wind, this abnormal wind that had blown us out of our course and marooned us on this plateau, was now prolonging our lives. What was the length of the reprieve it would grant us before our eyes began to fill with light? I went forward with the feeling of a man canoeing in mid-ocean. I will admit that at daybreak this landscape seemed to me less infernal, and that I began my walk with my hands in my pockets, like a tramp on a high road. The evening before we had set snares at the mouths of certain mysterious burrows in the ground, and the poacher in me was on the alert. I went first to have a look at our traps. They were empty. Well, this meant that I should not be drinking blood today, and indeed I hadn't expected to. But though I was not disappointed, my curiosity was aroused. What was there in the desert for these animals to live on? These were certainly the holes of phoenix, a long-eared carnivorous sandfox the size of a rabbit. I spotted the tracks made by one of them, and gave way to the impulse to follow them. They led to a narrow stream of sand, where each footprint was plainly outlined, and where I marveled at the pretty palm formed by the 3 toes spread fanwise on the sand. I could imagine my little friend trotting blithely along at dawn, and licking the dew off the rocks. Here the tracks were wider apart. My fennec had broken into a run, and now I see that a companion has joined him, and they have trotted on, side by side. These signs of a morning stroll gave me a strange thrill. They were signs of life, and I loved them for that. I almost forgot that I was thirsty. Finally I came to the pasture ground of my foxes. Here, every 100 yards or so, I saw sticking up out of the sand a small dry shrub, its twigs heavy with little golden snails. The fennec came here at dawn to do his marketing, and here I was able to observe another of nature's mysteries. My fennec did not stop at all the shrubs. There were some weighed down with snails which he disdained. Obviously he avoided them with some wariness. Others he stopped at, but did not strip of all they bore. He must have picked out 2 or 3 shells and then gone on to another restaurant. What was he up to? Was he nurseryman to the snails, encouraging their reproduction by refraining from exhausting the stock on a given shrub or a given twig? Or was he amusing himself by delaying repletion, putting off satiety, in order to enhance the pleasure he took from his morning stroll? The tracks led me back to the hole in which he lived. Doubtless my fennec crouched below, listening to me, and startled by the crunching of my footsteps. I said to him, "Fox, my little fox, I'm done for, but somehow that doesn't prevent me from taking an interest in your mood." And there I stayed a bit, ruminating and telling myself that a man was able to adapt himself to anything. The notion that he is to die in 30 years has probably never spoiled any man's fun. 30 years or 30 days. It's all a matter of perspective. Only, you have to be able to put certain visions out of your mind. I went on, finally, and the time came when, along with my weariness, something in me began to change. If those were not mirages, I was inventing them. "Hi! Hi there!" I shouted and waved my arms, but the man I had seen waving at me turned out to be a black rock. Everything in the desert had grown animate. I stooped to waken a sleeping Bedouin, and he turned into the trunk of a black tree. A tree trunk? Here, in the desert? I was amazed, and bent over to lift a broken bough. It was solid marble. Straightening up, I looked round and saw more black marble. An antediluvian forest littered the ground with its broken treetops. How many thousands years ago, under what hurricane of the time of Genesis, had this cathedral of wood crumbled in this spot? Countless centuries had rolled these fragments of giant pillars at my feet, polished them like steel, petrified and vitrified them, and endued them with the color of jet. I could distinguish the knots in their branches, the twistings of their once living boughs, could count the rings of life in them. This forest had rustled with birds and been filled with music that now was struck by doom and frozen into salt. and all this was hostile to me. Blacker than the chainmail of the hummocks, these solemn derelicts rejected me. What had I, a living man, to do with this incorruptible stone? Perishable as I was, I whose body was to crumble into dust, what place had I in this eternity? Since yesterday I had walked nearly 50 miles. The dizziness that I felt came doubtless from my thirst, or from the sun. It glittered on these hulks until they shone as if smeared with oil. It blazed down on this universal carapace. Sand and fox had no life here. This world was a gigantic anvil upon which the sun beat down. I strode across this anvil, and at my temples I could feel the hammer strokes of the sun. "Hi! Hi there!" I called out. "There is nothing there," I told myself. "Take it easy. You are delirious." I had to talk to myself aloud, had to bring myself to reason. It was hard for me to reject what I was seeing, hard not to run towards that caravan plodding on the horizon. "There, do you see it?" Fool, you know very well that you are inventing it. You mean that nothing in the world is real? Nothing in the world is real if that cross which I see 10 miles off on the top of a hill is not real. Or is it a lighthouse? No, the sea does not lie in that direction. Then it must be a cross. I spent the night studying my map, but uselessly, since I did not know my position. Still, I had scrutinized all the signs that marked the marvelous presence of man, and somewhere on the map I had seen a little circle surmounted by just such a cross. I had glanced down at the legend to get an explanation of the symbol, and had read, "Religious Institution." Close to the cross there had been a black dot. Again I had run my finger down the legend and had read, "Permanent Well." My heart jumped, and I had repeated the legend aloud. Permanent well, permanent well. What were all of Ali Baba's treasures compared with a permanent well? A little farther on, there were two white circles. Temporary wells, the legend said. Not quite so exciting. And round about them was nothing, unless it was the blankness of despair. But this must be my religious institution. The monks must certainly have planted a great cross on the hill expressly for men in our plight. All I had to do was walk across to them. I should be taken in by those Dominicans. But there are only Coptic monasteries in Libya, I told myself, by those learned Dominicans. They have a great cool kitchen with red tiles, and out in the courtyard a marvelous rusted pump. Beneath the rusted pump, you've guessed it, beneath the rusted pump is dug the permanent well. Ah, what rejoicing when I ring at their gate, when I get my hands on the rope of the great bell. Madman, you are describing a house in Provence, and what's more, the house has no bell. On the rope of the great bell, the porter will raise his arms to heaven and cry out, "You are the messenger of the Lord," and he will call aloud to all the monks. They will pour out of the monastery. They will welcome me with a great feast, as if I were the prodigal son. They will lead me to the kitchen, and will say to me, "One moment, my son, 1 moment. We'll just be off to the permanent well." And I shall be trembling with happiness. No, I will not weep just because there happens to be no cross on the hill. The treasures of the West turned out to be mere illusion. I have veered due north. At least the north is filled with the sound of the sea. Over the hilltop, look there at the horizon, the most beautiful city in the world. You know perfectly well that is a mirage. Of course I know it is a mirage. Am I the sort of man who can be fooled? But what if I want to go after that mirage? Suppose I enjoy indulging my hope. Suppose it suits me to love that crenellated town all beflagged with sunlight. What if I choose to walk straight ahead on light feet? For you must know that I have dropped my weariness behind me. I am happy now. Prévost and his gun. Don't make me laugh. I prefer my drunkenness. I am drunk. I am dying of thirst. It took the twilight to sober me. Suddenly I stopped, appalled to think how far I was from our base. In the twilight, the mirage was dying. The horizon had stripped itself of its pomp, its palaces, its priestly vestments. It was the old desert horizon again. A fine day's work you've done. Night will overtake you. You won't be able to go on before daybreak, and by that time your tracks will have been blown away, and you'll be properly nowhere. In that case, I may as well walk straight on. Why turn back? Why should I bring my ship around when I may find the sea straight ahead of me? When did you catch a glimpse of the sea? What makes you think you could walk that far? Meanwhile, there's Prévost watching for you beside the Simon. He may have been picked up by a caravan for all you know. Very good, I'll go back. But first, I want to call out for help. Hi! Hi! By God, you can't tell me this planet is not inhabited. Where are its men? Hi! Hi! I was hoarse. My voice was gone. I knew it was ridiculous to croak like this, but one more try. Hi! Hi! And I turned back. I had been walking 2 hours when I saw the flames of the bonfire that Prévost, frightened by my long absence, had set up. They mattered very little to me now. Another hour of trudging, 500 yards away, 100 yards, 50 yards. Good Lord! Amazement stopped me in my tracks. Joy surged up and filled my heart with its violence. In the firelight stood Prévost, talking to 2 Arabs who were leaning against the motor. He had not noticed me, for he was too full of his own joy. If only I had sat still and waited with him, I should have been saved already. Exultantly, I cried out, Hi! Hi! The 2 Bedouins gave a start and stared at me. Prévost left them standing and came forward to meet me. I opened my arms to him. He caught me by the elbow. Did he think I was keeling over? I said, At last, eh? What do you mean? The Arabs. What Arabs? Those Arabs there. With you. Prévost looked at me queerly, and when he spoke, I felt as if he was very reluctantly confiding a great secret to me. There are no Arabs there. This time, I know I am going to cry. A man can go 19 hours without water, and what have we drunk since last night? A few drops of dew at dawn. But the northeast wind is still blowing, still slowing up the process of our evaporation. To it, also, we owe the continued accumulation of high clouds. If only they would drift straight overhead and break into rain. But it never rains in the desert. Look here, Prévost. Let's rip up one of the parachutes and spread the sections out on the ground, weighed down with stones. If the wind stays in the same quarter till morning, they'll catch the dew, and we can wring them out into one of the tanks. We spread 6 triangular sections of parachute under the stars, and Prévost unhooked a fuel tank. This was as much as we could do for ourselves till dawn. But miracle of miracles, Prévost had come upon an orange while working over the tank. We shared it, and though it was little enough to men who could have used a few gallons of sweet water, still, I was overcome with relief. Stretched out beside the fire, I looked at the glowing fruit, and said to myself that men did not know what an orange was. Here we are, condemned to death, I said to myself, and still the certainty of dying cannot compare with the pleasure I am feeling. The joy I take from this half of an orange which I am holding in my hand is one of the greatest joys I have ever known. I lay flat on my back, sucking my orange and counting the shooting stars. Here I was, for 1 minute, infinitely happy. Nobody can know anything of the world in which the individual moves and has his being, I reflected. There is no guessing it. Only the man locked up in it can know what it is. For the first time, I understood the cigarette and glass of rum that are handed to the criminal about to be executed. I used to think that for a man to accept these wretched gifts at the foot of the gallows was beneath human dignity. Now I was learning that he took pleasure from them. People thought him courageous when he smiled as he smoked or drank. I knew now that he smiled because the taste gave him pleasure. People could not see that his perspective had changed, and that for him the last hour of his life was a life in itself. We collected an enormous quantity of water, perhaps as much as 2 quarts. Never again would we be thirsty. We were saved. We had liquid to drink. I dipped my tin cup into the tank and brought up a beautifully yellow-green liquid, the first mouthful of which nauseated me, so that despite my thirst, I had to catch my breath before swallowing it. I would have swallowed mud, I swear, but this taste of poisonous metal cut keener than thirst. I glanced at Prévost, and saw him going round and round with his eyes fixed to the ground as if looking for something. Suddenly he leaned forward and began to vomit without interrupting his spinning. Half a minute later, it was my turn. I was seized by such convulsions that I went down on my knees and dug my fingers into the sand while I puked. Neither of us spoke, and for a quarter of an hour we remained thus shaken, bringing up nothing but a little bile. After a time it passed, and all I felt was a vague, distant nausea. But our last hope had fled. Whether our bad luck was due to sizing on the parachute or to the magnesium lining of the tank, I never found out. Certain it was that we needed either another set of cloths or another receptacle. Well, it was broad daylight, and time we were on our way. This time we should strike out as fast as we could, leave this cursed plateau, and tramp till we dropped in our tracks. That was what Guillaume had done in the Andes. I had been thinking of him all the day before, and had determined to follow his example. I should do violence to the pilot's unwritten law, which is to stick by the ship, but I was sure no one would be along to look for us here. Once again we discovered that it was not we who were shipwrecked, not we, but those who were waiting for news of us. Those who were alarmed by our silence were already torn with grief by some atrocious and fantastic report. We could not but strive towards them. Guillaume had done it, had scrambled towards his lost ones. To do so is a universal impulse. If I were alone in the world, Prévost said, I'd lie down right here. Damned if I wouldn't. East, northeast we tramped. If we had in fact crossed the Nile, each step was leading us deeper and deeper into the desert. I don't remember anything about that day. I remember only my haste. I was hurrying desperately towards something, towards some finality. I remember also that I walked with my eyes to the ground, for the mirages were more than I could bear. From time to time we would correct our course by the compass, and now and again we would lie down to catch our breath. I remember having flung away my waterproof, which I had held onto as covering for the night. That is as much as I recall about the day. Of what happened when the chill of evening came, I remember more. But during the day I had simply turned to sand and was a being without mind. When the sun set, we decided to make camp. Oh, I knew as well as anybody that we should push on, that this one waterless night would finish us off. But we had brought along the bits of parachute, and if the poison was not in the sizing, we might get a sip of water next morning. Once again we spread our trap for the dew under the stars. But the sky in the north was cloudless. The wind no longer had the same taste on the lip. It had moved into another quarter. Something was rustling against us, but this time it seemed to be the desert itself. The wild beast was stalking us, had us in its power. I could feel its breath in my face. I could feel it lick my face and hands. Suppose I walked on, at the best I could do 5 or 6 miles more. Remember that in 3 days I had covered 100 miles, practically without water. And then, just as we stopped, Prévost said, I swear to you, I see a lake. You're crazy. Have you ever heard of a mirage after sunset? He challenged. I didn't seem able to answer him. I had long ago given up believing my own eyes. Perhaps it was not a mirage, But in that case, it was a hallucination. How could Prévost go on believing? But he was stubborn about it. "It's only 20 minutes off. I'll go have a look." His mulishness got on my nerves. "Go ahead," I shouted. "Take your little constitutional. Nothing better for a man. But let me tell you, if your lake exists, it is salt. And whether it's salt or not, it's a devil of a way off. And besides, there's no damned lake." Prévost was already on his way, his eyes glassy. I knew the strength of these irresistible obsessions. I was thinking, there are somnambulists who walk straight into locomotives. And I knew that Prévost would not come back. He would be seized by the vertigo of empty space and would be unable to turn back. And then he would keel over. He somewhere, and I somewhere else. Not that it was important. Thinking thus, it struck me that this mood of resignation was doing me no good. Once, when I was half drowned, I had let myself go like this. Lying now flat on my face on the stony ground, I took this occasion to write a letter for posthumous delivery. It gave me a chance, also, to take stock of myself again. I tried to bring up a little saliva. How long was it since I had spit? No saliva. If I kept my mouth closed, a kind of glue sealed my lips together. It dried on the outside of the lips and formed a hard crust. However, I found I was still able to swallow, and I bethought me that I was still not seeing a blinding light in my eyes. Once I was treated to that radiant spectacle, I might know that the end was a couple of hours away. Night fell. The moon had swollen since I last saw it. Prévost was still not back. I stretched out on my back and turned these few data over in my mind. A familiar impression came over me, and I tried to seize it. I was at sea. I was on a ship going south to South America, and was stretched out exactly like this on the boat deck. The tip of the mast was swaying to and fro very slowly among the stars. That mast was missing tonight, but again I was at sea, bound for a port I was to make without raising a finger. Slave traders had flung me on the ship. I thought of Prévost, who was still not back. Not once had I heard him complain. That was a good thing. To hear him whine would have been unbearable. Prévost was a man. What was that? 500 yards ahead of me I could see the light of his lamp. He had lost his way. I had no lamp with which to signal back. I stood up and shouted, but he could not hear me. A second lamp, and then a third. God in heaven! It was a search party, and it was me they were hunting. "Hi! Hi!" I shouted, but they had not heard me. The 3 lamps were still signaling me. "Tonight I am sane," I said to myself. "I am relaxed. I am not out of my head. Those are certainly 3 lamps, and they are about 500 yards off." I stared at them and shouted again, and again I gathered that they could not hear me. Then, for the first and only time, I was really seized with panic. I could still run, I thought. "Wait, wait!" I screamed. They seemed to be turning away from me, going off, hunting me elsewhere, and I stood tottering on the brink of life when there were arms out there ready to catch me. I shouted and screamed, again and again. They had heard me. An answering shout had come. I was strangling, suffocating, but I ran on, shouting as I ran until I saw Prévost, and keeled over. When I could speak again, I said, "Phew! When I saw all those lights." What lights? God in heaven! It was true. He was alone. This time I was beyond despair. I was filled with a sort of dumb fury. "What about your leg?" I rasped. As fast as I moved towards it, it moved back. I walked after it for about half an hour. Then it seemed still too far away, so I came back. But I am positive now that it is a lake. "You're crazy. Absolutely crazy. Why did you do it? Tell me. Why?" What had he done? Why had he done it? I was ready to weep with indignation, yet I scarcely knew why I was so indignant. Prévost mumbled his excuse. I felt I had to find some water. Your lips were awfully pale. Well, my anchor died within me. I passed my hand over my forehead as if I were waking out of sleep. I was suddenly sad. I said, "There was no mistake about it. I saw them as clearly as I see you now. 3 lights there were. I tell you, Prévost, I saw them." Prévost made no comment. "Well," he said finally, "I guess we're in a bad way." In this air devoid of moisture, the soil is swift to give off its temperature. It was already very cold. I stood up and stamped about, but soon a violent fit of trembling came over me. My dehydrated blood was moving sluggishly, and I was pierced by a freezing chill which was not merely the chill of night. My teeth were chattering, and my whole body had begun to twitch. My hand shook so that I could not hold an electric torch. I, who had never been sensitive to cold, was about to die of cold. What a strange effect thirst can have. Somewhere, tired of carrying it in the sun, I had let my waterproof drop. Now the wind was growing bitter, and I was learning that in the desert there is no place of refuge. The desert is as smooth as marble. By day it throws no shadow, by night it hands you over naked to the wind. Not a tree, not a hedge, not a rock behind which I could seek shelter. The wind was charging me like a troop of cavalry across open country. I turned and twisted to escape it. I lay down, stood up, lay down again, and still I was exposed to its freezing lash. I had no strength to run from the assassin, and under the saber stroke I tumbled to my knees, my head between my hands. A little later I pieced these bits together, and remembered that I had struggled to my feet and had started to walk on, shivering as I went. I had started forward, wondering where I was, and then I had heard Prévost. His shouting had jolted me into consciousness. I went back towards him, still trembling from head to foot, quivering with the attack of hiccups that was convulsing my whole body. To myself I said, "It isn't the cold, it's something else. It's the end." The simple fact was that I hadn't enough water in me. I had tramped too far yesterday and the day before when I was off by myself, and I was dehydrated. The thought of dying of the cold hurt me. I preferred the phantoms of my mind, the cross, the trees, the lamps. At least they would have killed me by enchantment. But to be whipped to death like a slave. Confound it! Down on my knees again! We had with us a little store of medicines, 100 grams of 90% alcohol, the same of pure ether, and a small bottle of iodine. I tried to swallow a little of the ether. It was like swallowing a knife. Then I tried the alcohol. It contracted my gullet. I dug a pit in the sand, lay down in it, and flung handfuls of sand over me until all but my face was buried in it. Prévost was able to collect a few twigs, and he lit a fire, which soon burnt itself out. He wouldn't bury himself in the sand, but preferred to stamp round and round in a circle. That was foolish. My throat stayed shut, and though I knew that was a bad sign, I felt better. I felt calm. I felt a peace that was beyond all hope. Once more, despite myself, I was journeying trussed up on the deck of my slave ship under the stars. It seemed to me that I was perhaps not in such a bad pass, after all. So long as I lay absolutely motionless, I no longer felt the cold. This allowed me to forget my body buried in the sand. I said to myself that I would not budge an inch, and would, therefore, never suffer again. As a matter of fact, we really suffer very little. Back of all these torments there is the orchestration of fatigue or of delirium, and we live on in a kind of picture book, a slightly cruel fairy tale. A little while ago the wind had been after me with whip and spur, and I was running in circles like a frightened fox. After that came a time when I couldn't breathe. A great knee was crushing in my chest. A knee. I was writhing in vain to free myself from the weight of the angel who had overthrown me. There had not been a moment when I was alone in this desert. But now I have ceased to believe in my surroundings. I have withdrawn into myself, and have shut my eyes, have not so much as batted an eyelid. I have the feeling that this torrent of visions is sweeping me away to a tranquil dream. So rivers cease their turbulence in the embrace of the sea. Farewell, eyes that I loved. Do not blame me if the human body cannot go 3 days without water. I should never have believed that man was so truly the prisoner of the springs and freshets. I had no notion that our self-sufficiency was so circumscribed. We take it for granted that a man is able to stride straight out into the world. We believe that man is free. We never see the cord that binds him to wells and fountains, that umbilical cord by which he is tied to the womb of the world. Let man take but one step too many, and the cord snaps. Apart from your suffering, I have no regrets. All in all, it has been a good life. If I got free of this, I should start right in again. A man cannot live a decent life in cities, and I need to feel myself live. I am not thinking of aviation. The airplane is a means, not an end. One doesn't risk one's life for a plane any more than a farmer plows for the sake of the plow. But the airplane is a means of getting away from towns and their bookkeeping, and coming to grips with reality. Flying is a man's job, and its worries are a man's worries. A pilot's business is with the wind, with the stars, with night, with sand, with the sea. He strives to outwit the forces of nature. He stares in expectancy for the coming of dawn the way a gardener awaits the coming of spring. He looks forward to port as to a promised land, and truth for him is what lives in the stars. I have nothing to complain of. For 3 days I have tramped the desert, have known the pangs of thirst, have followed false scents in the sand, have pinned my faith on the dew. I have struggled to rejoin my kind, whose very existence on earth I had forgotten. These are the cares of men alive in every fibre, and I cannot help thinking them more important than the fretful choosing of a nightclub in which to spend the evening. Compare the one life with the other, and all things considered, this is luxury. I have no regrets. I have gambled and lost. It was all in the day's work. At least I have had the unforgettable taste of the sea on my lips. I am not talking about living dangerously. Such words are meaningless to me. The toreador does not stir me to enthusiasm. It is not danger I love. I know what I love. It is life. The sky seemed to me faintly bright. I drew up one arm through the sand. There was a bit of the torn parachute within reach, and I ran my hand over it. It was bone dry. Let's see. Dew falls at dawn. Here was dawn risen and no moisture on the cloth. My mind was befuddled, and I heard myself say, "There is a dry heart here, a dry heart that cannot know the relief of tears." I scrambled to my feet. "We're off, Prévost," I said. "Our throats are still open. Get along, man." The wind that shrivels up a man in 19 hours was now blowing out of the west. My gullet was not yet shut, but it was hard and painful, and I could feel that there was a rasp in it. Soon that cough would begin what I had been told about, and was now expecting. My tongue was becoming a nuisance, but most serious of all, I was beginning to see shining spots before my eyes. When those spots changed into flames, I should simply lie down. The first morning hours were cool, and we took advantage of them to get on at a good pace. We knew that once the sun was high, there would be no more walking for us. We no longer had the right to sweat, certainly not to stop and catch our breath. This coolness was merely the coolness of low humidity. The prevailing wind was coming from the desert, and under its soft and treacherous caress, the blood was being dried out of us. Our first day's nourishment had been a few grapes. In the next 3 days each of us ate half an orange and a bit of cake. If we had had anything left now, we couldn't have eaten it because we had no saliva with which to masticate it. But I had stopped being hungry. Thirsty I was, yes, and it seemed to me that I was suffering less from thirst itself than from the effects of thirst. Gullet hard, tongue like plaster of Paris, a rasping in the throat, a horrible taste in the mouth. All these sensations were new to me, and though I believed water could rid me of them, nothing in my memory associated them with water. Thirst had become more and more a disease and less a craving. I began to realize that the thought of water and fruit was now less agonizing than it had been. I was forgetting the radiance of the orange just as I was forgetting the eyes under the hat brim. Perhaps I was forgetting everything. We had sat down after all, but it could not be for long. Nevertheless, it was impossible to go 500 yards without our legs giving way. To stretch out on the sand would be marvelous, but it could not be. The landscape had begun to change. Rocky places grew rarer, and the sand was now firm beneath our feet. A mile ahead stood dunes, and on those dunes we could see a scrubby vegetation. At least this sand was preferable to the steely surface over which we had been trudging. This was the Golden Desert. This might have been the Sahara. This was, in a sense, my country. 200 yards had now become our limit, but we had determined to carry on until we reached the vegetation. Better than that we could not hope to do. A week later, when we went back over our traces in a car to have a look at the Simoon, I measured this last lap and found that it was just short of 50 miles. All told, we had done 124 miles. The previous day I had tramped without hope. Today the word hope had grown meaningless. Today we were tramping simply because we were tramping. Probably oxen work for the same reason. Yesterday I had dreamed of a paradise of orange trees. Today I would not give a button for paradise. I did not believe these oranges existed. When I thought about myself, I found in me nothing but a heart squeezed dry. I was tottering, but emotionless. I felt no distress whatever, and in a way I regretted it. Misery would have seemed to me as sweet as water. I might then have felt sorry for myself, and commiserated with myself as with a friend. But I had not a friend left on earth. Later, when we were rescued, seeing our burnt-out eyes, men thought we must have called aloud and wept and suffered. But cries of despair, misery, sobbing, grief are a kind of wealth, and we possessed no wealth. When a young girl is disappointed in love, she weeps and knows sorrow. Sorrow is one of the vibrations that prove the fact of living. I felt no sorrow. I was in the desert. I could no longer bring up a little saliva. Neither could I any longer summon those moving visions towards which I should have loved to stretch forth arms. The sun had dried up the springs of tears in me. And yet, what was that? A ripple of hope went through me like a faint breeze over a lake. What was this sign that had awakened my instinct before knocking on the door of my consciousness? Nothing had changed, and yet everything was changed. This sheet of sand, those low hummocks, and sparse tufts of verdure that had been a landscape, were now become a stage setting. Thus far the stage was empty, but the scene was set. I looked at Prévost. The same astonishing thing had happened to him as to me, but he was far from guessing its significance as I was. I swear to you that something is about to happen. I swear that life has sprung in this desert. I swear that life has sprung in this desert. I swear that this emptiness, this stillness, has suddenly become more stirring than a tumult on the public square. Prévost! Footprints! We are saved! We had wandered from the trail of the human species. We had cast ourselves forth from the tribe. We had found ourselves alone on earth and forgotten by the universal migration. And here, imprinted in the sand, were the divine and naked feet of man. Look, Prévost. Here 2 men stood together, and then separated. Here a camel knelt, here... But it was not true that we were already saved. It was not enough to squat down and wait. Before long we should be past saving. Once the cough has begun, the progress made by thirst is swift. Still, I believed that in that caravan swaying somewhere in the desert, heavy with its cargo of treasure. We went on. Suddenly, I heard a cock crow. I remembered what Guillaume had told me. Towards the end, I heard cocks crowing in the Andes, and I heard the railway train. The instant the cock crowed, I thought of Guillaume, and I said to myself, first it was my eyes that played tricks on me. I suppose this is another of the effects of thirst. Probably my ears have merely held out longer than my eyes. But Prévost grabbed my arm. Did you hear that? What? The cock? Why, yes, I did. To myself, I said, fool, get it through your head. This means life. I had one last hallucination. 3 dogs chasing one another. Prévost looked, but could not see them. However, both of us waved our arms at a Bedouin. Both of us shouted with all the breath in our bodies and laughed for happiness. But our voices could not carry 30 yards. The Bedouin on his slow-moving camel had come into view from behind a dune, and now he was moving slowly out of sight. The man was probably the only Arab in this desert, sent by a demon to materialize and vanish before the eyes of us who could not run. We saw in profile on the dune another Arab. We shouted, but our shouts were whispers. We waved our arms, and it seemed to us that they must fill the sky with monstrous signals. Still, the Bedouin stared with averted face away from us. At last, slowly, he began a right-angle turn in our direction. At the very second when he came face to face with us, I thought the curtain would come down. At the very second when his eyes met ours, thirst would vanish, and by this man would death and the mirages be wiped out. Let this man but make a quarter turn left, and the world is changed. Let him but bring his torso around, but sweep the scene with a glance, and, like a god, he can create life. The miracle had come to pass. He was walking towards us over the sand, like a god over the waves. The Arab looked at us without a word. He placed his hand upon our shoulders, and we obeyed him. We stretched out upon the sand. Race, language, religion were forgotten. There was only this humble nomad with the eyes of an archangel on our shoulders. Face to the sand, we waited. And when the water came, we drank like calves with our faces in the basin, and with a greediness which alarmed the Bedouin so that from time to time he pulled us back. But as soon as his hand fell away from us, we plunged our faces anew into the water. Water thou hast no taste, no colour, no odour, canst not be defined, art relished while ever mysterious. Not necessary to life, but rather life itself, thou fillest us with a gratification that exceeds the delight of the senses. By thy might there return into us treasures that we had abandoned. By thy grace there are released in us all the dried-up runnels of our heart. Of the riches that exist in the world, thou art the rarest and also the most delicate. Thou so pure within the bowels of the earth. A man may die of thirst lying beside a magnesian spring. He may die within reach of a salt lake. He may die though he hold in his hand a jug of dew, if it be inhabited by evil salts. For thou, water, art a proud divinity, allowing no alteration, no foreignness in thy being, and the joy that thou spreadest is an infinitely simple joy. You, Bedouin of Libya, who saved our lives, though you will dwell forever in my memory, yet I shall never be able to recapture your features. You are humanity, and your face comes into my mind simply as man incarnate. You, our beloved fellow man, did not know who we might be, and yet you recognized us without fail, and I, in my turn, shall recognize you in the faces of all mankind. You came towards me in an aureole of charity and magnanimity, bearing the gift of water. All my friends and all my enemies marched towards me in your person. It did not seem to me that you were rescuing me. Rather did it seem that you were forgiving me. And I felt I had no enemy left in all the world. This is the end of my story. Lifted on to a camel, we went on for 3 hours. Then, broken with weariness, we asked to be set down at a camp while the cameleers went on ahead for help. Towards 6 in the evening, a car manned by armed Bedouins came to fetch us. A half-hour later, we were set down at the house of a Swiss engineer named Racot, who was operating a soda factory beside saline deposits in the desert. He was unforgettably kind to us. By midnight, we were in Cairo. I awoke between white sheets. Through the curtains came the rays of a sun that was no longer an enemy. I spread butter and honey on my bread. I smiled. I recaptured the savor of my childhood and all its marvels, and I read and reread the telegram from those dearest to me in all the world, whose 3 words had shattered me. So terribly happy.